beneath the tranquil surface of consciousness, beyond reason and all human certainty, lies an ancient, vast, unfathomable labyrinth. A place where thoughts twist upon themselves, where memories fragment into endless corridors, a living maze, built from your oldest fears, your darkest secrets, and everything you deny, even when no one is watching. This labyrinth is the human mind, and there was one man who dared to explore it, without a compass, without light, driven by an obsession teetering on the edge of madness. His name was Sigmund Freud. Freud didn't merely walk these mental corridors. He tore them open, dug into their depths, forced them to reveal what they were hiding. Yet the deeper he ventured, the more he seemed to lose himself. For in this labyrinth, there are doors that should never be opened, shadows that resist being named, and presences that linger in the corners of memory. Some hail him as the father of modern psychology. Others condemn him for building a science on interpretation and speculation. But one thing is certain, Freud forever changed the way we understand what it means to be human. What truly drove him to become obsessed with the unconscious? Why did he manipulate certain cases to fit his theories? What truths were buried in the letters he destroyed before his death? And why did some of his most important patients vanish from the official records? Step carefully as you follow his path through the labyrinth of the mind. For in this place, those who enter do not always find their way out. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Freiburg, a small town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now part of the Czech Republic, into a Jewish family that valued education and culture. Freud was a polyglot. Besides his native German, he learned French, English, and Italian as an adult. He also studied Latin and Greek as part of his academic training and had some knowledge of Hebrew from his Jewish upbringing. At 17, he entered the University of Vienna to study medicine, driven by a question that would haunt him his entire life. What makes a person who they are? At that time, neuroscience was in its infancy, and physicians dissected corpses to understand the structure of the brain. Freud spent years studying how nerves transmitted signals, searching for the biological foundation that gives rise to the mind. It was the 19th century. Science was beginning to replace religion as the explanation for the world. Freud, raised in a Jewish family but skeptical by nature, wanted to prove that what we call the soul was not mystical, but the result of the brain's workings. Through dissecting brains, he observed that physical lesions could alter behavior, memory, and personality. This convinced him that the mind depended on the body. Thoughts, dreams, and desires, he believed, did not float in some spiritual realm. They emerged from biological processes, even if they could not yet be directly observed. In 1884, Freud, now a young doctor and researcher, experimented with cocaine for scientific purposes. At the time, it was legal and regarded as a promising stimulant. Obtained through the university pharmacy, he published his first major paper, Über Coca, on cocaine, advocating its use as a tonic and anesthetic. A few years later, his friend and patient Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow developed a severe addiction. Freud realized the drug's dangerous effects and abandoned his experiments. The cocaine episode became the darkest chapter of his medical career, still debated today. Was it scientific curiosity, personal obsession, or ethical recklessness? In 1885, Freud traveled to Paris to study under the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who used hypnosis to treat hysteria. In Vienna, Freud had observed patients with strange symptoms, inexplicable paralysis, convulsions, crises that defied medical explanation. Conventional theories were insufficient. He sensed something deeper, hidden, a labyrinth within the mind that he had yet to understand. At the Salpêtrière, Freud witnessed demonstrations that both fascinated and disturbed him. Patients moved and spoke as if guided by invisible forces. He realized that physical symptoms could have emotional causes. This revelation changed his thinking forever. The origin of human suffering was not always in the body. It often resided in the unconscious mind. Upon his return to Vienna, Freud began putting these ideas into practice. Together with Joseph Breuer, he treated the famous case of Anna O., a young woman from the upper bourgeoisie who suffered partial paralysis, vision disturbances, difficulty speaking, and episodes of confusion that left her trapped within her own body. Doctors could find no explanation. Her symptoms defied any known illness. They let Anna speak, letting her recount her deepest memories and emotions, guiding her with patience. And something remarkable happened. Each time Anna voiced a trauma, a hidden fear, a repressed memory, some of her symptoms vanished, even if only temporarily. Her case became legendary, and for Freud, it was a revelation. Behind every symptom, behind every fear, lay a hidden territory, a subconscious full of secrets and shadows waiting to be explored. From this experience, the concept of the talking cure was born. In 1895, Freud and Breuer published Studies on Hysteria, a book that marked a rupture with traditional medicine. For the first time, they suggested that physical symptoms could arise from repressed memories and desires. But their collaboration soon fractured. Breuer withdrew, while Freud delved deeper into the darkness of the human mind. In 1896, Freud made a decisive step. He gave his method a name. He called it psychoanalysis.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges, and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis, as a new method of treatment of the neurosis.
That same year, his father, Jakob Freud, passed away. The loss opened an emotional abyss that pushed Freud to look inward. His personal crisis became scientific fuel. In 1897, Freud began an unprecedented self-analysis. He examined his dreams, his memories, his childhood fantasies, everything most would prefer to leave in shadow. From this introspection emerged ideas that would forever transform psychology: repression, unconscious desire, and the controversial Oedipus complex. Freud no longer studied the mind from the outside. He explored it from within his own internal labyrinths. Finally, in 1900, Freud published his most influential work, The Interpretation of Dreams. He proposed that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. Behind every dream image lay repressed desires, hidden impulses, and disguised messages. But the scientific world was not ready. For years, his book was ignored, criticized, or outright ridiculed. Freud claimed that every dream is the fulfillment of a repressed wish, a phrase that scandalized Viennese society, obsessed with morality and self-control.
I had to pay heavily for this big of good luck. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. The system was strong and unrelenting.
Despite rejection, Freud continued building his theoretical system. Between 1901 and 1905, he wrote about slips of the tongue, jokes, and childhood memories, convinced that every error, every seemingly trivial word, revealed unconscious forces at work. It was a period of intense intellectual solitude. Freud advanced alone, guided only by the conviction that he had discovered an unknown mental territory. In 1905, Freud released 3 groundbreaking works: The Study of Little Hands, his analysis of the case of Dora, and 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, perhaps his most controversial masterpiece. In that book, he proposed a radical idea: sexuality begins in childhood, and the human psyche, he argued, evolves through psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. These ideas were branded obscene, scandalous. The Viennese press mocked him. Religious leaders condemned him as a corrupter. Many colleagues turned their backs on him. But Freud was not seeking provocation. He was trying to reveal the truth: how desire and repression shape the foundation of the human personality. Between 1906 and 1909, the psychoanalytic movement began to expand beyond Vienna. Enter Carl Gustav Jung, a young Swiss psychiatrist who became Freud's favored disciple.
I'd written a book about the psychology of dementia precognizant called Schizophrenia then. I sent him that book. I went to Vienna for a fortnight and then we had very long and penetrating conversations.
To Freud, Jung represented the future, a hope that psychoanalysis could transcend cultural and religious barriers, reaching further than he himself might ever go. In 1909, Freud crossed the Atlantic for the first time. He traveled to the United States, accompanied by Jung and Ferenczi, to deliver a series of lectures at Clark University. There, in front of a surprised and divided audience, he presented his ideas on the unconscious, dreams, and infantile sexuality. It was the first major international triumph of psychoanalysis. But assent brings tensions. Freud noticed deep differences in Jung, a more spiritual vision, less tied to desire and repressed sexuality. Though Freud protected him, the cracks were already forming. In 1910, to consolidate the movement and prevent fragmentation, Freud spearheaded the creation of the International Psychoanalytical Association. Yet even within its walls, the storm was already brewing. Theories diversified, egos clashed, and the very psychological shadows Freud had studied began to surface within his own circle. The rupture came in 1913. It was traumatic, personal, and final. Jung left psychoanalysis, and Freud felt he had lost not just a disciple, but an intellectual son. The fracture marked the end of an era and ushered in a period of emotional isolation that would echo through his work.
Well, he was a complicated nature, you know. From the very beginning, there was a discrepancy. His approach was naturally different from mine because his personality was different from mine. I submitted quite a lot of my dreams to him, and so did he.
And he to you, yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes. But do you remember now what were the significant features of Freud's dreams that you noted at the time?
Well, that is rather indiscreet to ask. You know, there is such a thing as a professional secret.
He's been dead these many years.
Yes, but regards last longer than life. I prefer not to talk about it.
Freud also decided to create the Committee, its mission to protect psychoanalysis from enemies, both external and internal. The 6 founding members, Jones, Rank, Ferenczi, Abraham, Eitingon, and Sachs, received from Freud a singular object, an identical ring, adorned with the image of a Roman emperor. In a Europe teeming with lodges, philosophical fraternities, and esoteric circles, Freud fashioned his own version. A personal guard, a disciplined brotherhood tasked with safeguarding his work. Each year, the committee convened, reviewing the state of psychoanalysis worldwide, analyzing threats, debating institutional inheritances, and drafting private reports for Freud. Sometimes they discussed theories, other times, people. They decided who was ready to rise and who should be kept on the margins. This dynamic was strikingly similar to other semi-clandestine organizations of the era, from Masonic lodges to Rosicrucian circles that flourished among European intellectuals. And although the committee did not perform esoteric rituals, its closed structure, the use of symbolic rings, and its mission of vigilance created an unmistakable aura of a secret society. During that decade, Freud published increasingly profound and philosophical works. In Totem and Taboo, 1913, he compared social and religious norms to the repressed desires of primitive humanity. The work was considered blasphemous. Freud suggested that morality and religion sprang from instinct and guilt, not from divinity. In 1914, he wrote, On Narcissism, an introduction, where he argued that before we love the world, before we even relate to others, we love ourselves, and that this self-love never entirely disappears. In the essay, Freud proposed that narcissism was not merely a pathology, but a universal stage of human development, an original state in which libido, the energy of desire, is directed entirely toward the self. He called this primary narcissism. But Freud went further. He described how, in the face of injury, loss, or rejection, even adults could withdraw from the world and return to this inner refuge. This he called secondary narcissism, a mechanism by which the ego protects itself, but also isolates itself. For Freud, narcissism was not just a diagnosis, it was a key, a small crack through which the secret machinery of the human being could be glimpsed. Meanwhile, Europe was sinking into the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, Freud watched as his patients, his colleagues, and even his own children were swept up by the conflict. External violence seemed to confirm what he had already intuited, that the human mind is not governed solely by desire and the pursuit of pleasure, but also by destructive, irrational forces capable of annihilating everything. The war became a brutal mirror of the collective unconscious. In these chaotic years, Freud continued to write without pause, publishing fundamental texts on dreams, analytical technique, and everyday psychopathology. But something in his thinking began to shift. The war awakened a new question in him. What if within every person there existed a dark drive beyond pleasure inclined toward conflict and destruction? By 1920, this intuition crystallized into a formal theory. Freud wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, one of his most enigmatic and unsettling works. There, he introduced the idea of two primary forces, Eros, the life drive, and Thanatos, the death drive. Freud suggested that within each of us lies an unconscious tendency toward destruction, repetition, and a return to nothingness. This theory not only shook his followers, it forever changed the way we understand human suffering. That same year, his daughter Sophie Freud, only 26, suddenly died in Hamburg from pneumonia, likely a complication of the Spanish flu. Freud was devastated. For months, he wrote nothing, and confessed to his colleagues that, though he had studied grief for years, no theory prepares a parent to lose a child. In 1921, he published Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, examining how individuals lose their sense of self within groups or movements, anticipating social phenomena that would define the 20th century. In 1923, his young grandson, Heinrich Freud, Sophie's son, whom Freud adored and saw as a living memory of her, also died. This second tragedy reopened old wounds. In a letter to his friend Ludwig Binswanger, Freud wrote, "I have lost Sophie again, in her child. There is no solace for a pain like this." That same year, his doctor, Felix Deutsch, discovered a concerning lesion in the roof of his mouth. Freud had oral cancer, a squamous carcinoma caused by decades of smoking. He underwent an initial surgery by the surgeon Hans Pichler. The operation removed part of the tumor but left a gap in his palate, requiring an internal prosthesis so he could speak and eat. Far from an ending, the surgery marked the beginning of a long ordeal. The cancer returned again and again, demanding more than 30 procedures, increasingly painful prosthetics, and relentless suffering that would define his daily life. Yet Freud continued to write, teach, and think, even when speaking or eating became almost impossible tasks. In 1923, Sigmund Freud published The Ego and the Id, a work that would forever change our understanding of the human mind. In it, Freud proposed that the psyche is not a unified, harmonious entity, but a battleground of forces in constant conflict. At the deepest level lies the id, the reservoir of our most primitive impulses, sexual desires, aggression, survival instincts. The id acts without consciousness, without morality, seeking immediate gratification while ignoring consequences and the reality around it. Opposing it is the ego, the mediator between impulse and the external world. The ego negotiates, calculates, plans, striving to satisfy the ide's desires, but in a way that is acceptable to reality. It is the voice of reason, fighting to maintain a fragile balance between inner demands and the outside world. And above both stands the superego, the internalized moral conscience, shaped by the rules, norms, and expectations inherited from our parents and society. The superego judges, represses, induces guilt and pride, confronting the ego to control the impulses unleashed by the id. For Freud, these three components were not just theoretical concepts. They were living forces, shaping us, pushing us, restraining us, torturing us. The conflict between them was constant, often invisible, stirring anxiety, neurosis, and ethical dilemmas that accompany us from childhood to death. But while Freud explored the labyrinths within the psyche, the world around him darkened. Vienna, his native city, simmered with growing political unrest. Anti-Semitism became increasingly visible, and early nationalist movements were gaining strength. Freud, Jewish intellectual, publicly recognized, watched with concern as an ideology emerged that would soon become an existential threat. During these years, Freud continued to write with intensity. He published foundational texts such as Inhibition, Symptom, and Anxiety, 1926, and The Future of an Illusion, 1927, in which he argued that religion is a childhood need for protection, a collective illusion born of fear. By the end of the decade, the shadows of Nazism already loomed over Austria. His books were burned in public squares, his name invoked as a symbol of intellectual degeneration, and his disciples began fleeing the country. Freud observed it all with clarity and with the bitter certainty that the irrational forces he had studied all his life, destructive impulses, fanaticism, violence, fear, were now manifesting in the political reality of Europe. Perhaps it was the most disturbing confirmation of his own ideas. In 1930, he presented Civilization and Its Discontents, one of his most widely read works. There, he explored the eternal tension between individual desire and the rules imposed by society. For Freud, civilization is possible only if humans repress their impulses, but that repression condemns us to unhappiness. He was seen as pessimistic, even by his own disciples, yet he forever shaped modern thought on freedom and social constraint. His illness worsened, but despite constant pain and countless surgeries, Freud continued to see patients, write, and correspond with colleagues worldwide. His work became both a refuge and a form of resistance against the adversity surrounding him. In 1938, with the Nazi occupation of Austria, Freud was ordered to leave Vienna. At 82, he accepted exile to London, accompanied by his wife Martha and some of his children. The journey was heavy with sorrow and nostalgia. He left behind the city that had been the stage of his life and work, Vienna, which had seen psychoanalysis grow from a small apartment to a global movement. In London, Freud worked with determination, though his health rapidly declined. Despite this, he completed some of his final reflections, consolidating concepts that would be essential for the future of psychoanalysis. In 1939, shortly before his death, he published his last and most controversial work, Moses and Monotheism. There, he suggested that Moses was not Hebrew, but Egyptian, and that monotheistic religion derived from a symbolic murder of the father. The reactions were furious. Freud, a Jewish exile from the Nazis, was accused of betraying his own people. Yet beyond the scandal, the book was his intellectual farewell, the synthesis of his entire vision of the mind, guilt, and civilization. On September 23, 1939, Sigmund Freud passed away, ending a life defined by intellectual curiosity, a passion for the human mind, and courage in the face of physical suffering and historical adversity. In his final days, he made a decision that still unsettles historians. He destroyed much of his personal correspondence. With unsettling lucidity, he selected documents from his personal archives. He read them one last time, then cast them into the fire. Letters containing doubts, secret quarrels, ambiguous relationships, dreams he never dared interpret. Everything that should not escape the labyrinth that had accompanied him his entire life. He was not alone. By his side, his daughter Anna and some of his most faithful disciples assisted in silence. They knew he was destroying treasures of psychological history, yet they understood that Freud was protecting a part of himself that no one else should traverse. What was in those letters? Clinical cases that contradicted his theories, family secrets, shadows that had followed him from Vienna. No one knows. Freud himself decided that these passages of the labyrinth must vanish. Thus, as his life faded, Freud burned his own maps, and he left behind an incomplete labyrinth, dazzling on the surface, unfathomable in its depths. A forbidden labyrinth that still feeds suspicion, questions, and a silence that seems to tell us some truths were never meant to see the light of day.